So wow guys, that was quite the ending for Westworld Season 3, which also sets up for a very interesting Season 4, even though that is a long way away. But Episode 8, titled Crisis Theory, gave us many twists, turns, some answers, some more mysteries of course, as well as Dolores' true intentions, and so much more to unpack in today's breakdown and review. To be honest, I'm just going to get straight into it, as this video might be a bit longer than usual with this breakdown, with everything we just have to discuss, and by the end of the video going into where things could be headed for Westworld in the future. But if you are brand new to the channel, I have covered Westworld all season long, so I'll leave that in the cards above, but make sure you subscribe for all kinds of coverage on the future of Westworld, with Season 4 of course, despite it being way down the line, as well as bonus Westworld videos diving into the repercussions from what this finale gave us. And as usual, there's a ton of speculation that we can get into. So I actually really liked the choice of scenes that were included in the recap for this episode, and that's kind of strange at the same time. Why am I covering the recap? Because the prominent one was from seeing Ford once again, talking about if Dolores were to take on the bigger role for herself, would she be the hero or the villain? And of course, that's been the question on many fans' minds since the beginning of this season, since the show has shown us a couple of sides to Dolores throughout all 8 of these episodes that show the conviction and dedication she has for her plan to be seen through, which has been displayed through quite a lot of violence along the way. But by the end of this episode, as a lot of us thought anyway moving throughout the season, her hands were dirtied along the way, in some cases as a means to an end. But the thing is, her end goal wasn't as sinister as some may have thought, despite blurring the line at times of Ford's speculation of being hero and villain. I also really liked the beginning scenes with Dolores in Westworld, which highlighted a bit of her journey and trauma of the past through the narration of seeing the ugliness in this world and the disarray. It really contrasts the one near the end with Maeve, of course. Now in the beginning scene of this episode, she describes how she was taught to see the beauty, but that it was a lie, and when she saw the world for what it really was, she realized how little beauty there was in it. Now this almost indicates and somewhat gives off an antagonistic perspective from Dolores at the beginning of this episode, with the end shining the light on how there is indeed beauty, but instead of her giving up completely on that for the human race, she hopes that maybe they can find it for themselves. But continuing off from last episode, we saw one of Serac's men looking at Dolores' EMP'd body with her host control unit recovered by Caleb. You could also argue that he could have taken Maeve's out and destroyed her, but perhaps he wasn't really thinking too clearly then, or he just thought that maybe he didn't have enough time and just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible with Dolores. Just for anyone who looks into it a bit deeply about why didn't this happen or why didn't that happen, I always want to try and take that into account. We then saw Caleb riding away with her host control unit on his bike, as we get to see the chaos unfolding and ensuing in the world because of the Rehoboam leak. And for those who point out that I say Rehoboam instead of Rehoboam, sometimes I say it wrong, but it's just hard, okay? It's hard sometimes. I'm just used to saying Rehoboam, but it's Rehoboam. But on another note, for any gamers out there, did the police here remind anyone of the enemies in Half-Life games, or was that just me? But moving on, Caleb revives Dolores where she kept a host copy of herself, but this model was one of the earlier models of hosts, of which Dolores described later, they built us to last before they made us as weak as they are. Now I have to say as well, and I'm sure all of us can agree on this, the CGI in this scene was so masterfully done. It was just crazy seeing this older host version of Dolores with her face split open like that as her host control unit went in, and then with her re-sleeving herself with the skin. I just thought it was great. Now I was hoping, like how I mentioned in my previous review, and it seems that quite a few of you agreed with this in the comments, in how it felt like there was almost this revelation-like scene missing out of Caleb learning and acknowledging that Dolores is a host, or at least some form of conversation between them both about it, but we still really didn't get that here. I mean, we should have got it last episode, really, after the whole episode where he learned that she got shot, and he's just like, well, how is that possible? We didn't get it in the following episode, but we didn't really get it here. But an explanation we did get in these scenes is when Caleb questioned why Dolores knows exactly what he'll do, and that's because just like the Delos parks, such as Westworld, with William's old project of putting these mind-reading like devices faces and the hats that people wore in Westworld, the exact same thing applied in military training, in where the government wanted their soldiers trained with live targets, and Delos were more than happy to supply their hosts, and in the soldiers' helmets, they were fitted with the exact same tech that would take into account everything Caleb would be doing and cataloging his every move and decision. Now, this moment also highlighted a much more significant aspect in play here as to why Dolores chose Caleb, and this was shown through the flashbacks in where Caleb's soldiers wanted to, let's just say, mistreat the hosts in the military training exercise when no one was looking, just like a lot of rich people did at Westworld. And even though we didn't get the whole flashback at this part of the episode completed, it was fairly obvious to the audience that Caleb would not have been on board with that. But just skipping forward to that moment with Maeve and Caleb for a second, and where we did get the flashbacks to link it to this part, Dolores didn't choose Caleb for his capacity for violence, it was his capacity to choose, and in that moment we saw the camera pan to the woman hosts who were a part of that military training exercise, in where one of them was actually Dolores. And we saw how Caleb talked his military friends out of doing what they were going to do with them, and this was significant to Dolores because obviously she wasn't aware or awake at that point in time, but even now, obviously she could remember that memory, and when going about choosing Caleb this season, well, she wanted to go for him. But as for Caleb, he obviously doesn't recognize Dolores from back then, whether that's a part of the AR therapy or if it was just a long time ago and it was somewhat of an insignificant memory to him, because if he did, he would have known that she was a host from the get-go. Now, by this point in the episode, things were really ramping up. Serac had identified Caleb and had sent Maeve to retrieve Dolores because he really wants that Sector 16 data more than ever, and the world was truly falling apart with the chaos that we spoke about earlier seeming like child's play to the anarchy that was unfolding in the city at this point. Now, I still admire this episode and season in general for the subtle villainous picture of Dolores they paint at times, and if not total villainous, as I said earlier, somewhat antagonistic, with at this point in the episode the line from Caleb mentioning as they were walking throughout those streets and how the world looks a little like a nightmare, and her saying change is messy and difficult, which definitely gives off the impression that she might not really care too much about all of this chaos unfolding. But with that ending for Dolores, and you know, with this episode in mind, she's just doing what is necessary to offer humanity another chance and freedom. Now, here in the episode, Dolores had hired men who addressed Caleb as Sir because she had already set the wheels in motion for every revolution needing a leader, and that of course being Caleb. But as the audience at this point, we kind of knew all of this had been foreshadowed about Caleb for quite some time now, with her choosing him being the leader for the humans, which was teased at in last episode, but more about that with the actual ending. But before we get into that, this is where Charlotte Hale appeared to Dolores, and things got very much so more interesting, because Charlotte Hale really was the wild card in this episode and season, I guess, especially from where she started cracking. And I'm not saying that I could predict everything that was going to happen with everything else, because of course not. This is, you know, this is Westworld after all. But with her, especially with this new darker path she seemed to be going down, teased at that one scene in the last episode, really made me feel like, you know, well, I just have no idea what she's going to do next. And they had a really interesting conversation, summarized to the point of how Charlotte feels as though Dolores knew she would go back into Hale's house and that she wouldn't make it. So that just goes into how she was concerned about the Connells' death as well. It's just like she saw this coming for her as well, and she was right. And for Charlotte Hale, this does just solidify Dolores' disregard of her copies, and thus really infusing her with disdain for Dolores. Now, even with Dolores' conclusion in mind of this episode, I do want to reflect on this briefly. I mean, did Dolores really not care for her copies? Because I think she did, but I think she also knew that they were a means to an end. I mean, which is obviously cold, but as I keep mentioning throughout my reviews, Dolores' conviction with her mission, albeit ultimately for the righteous reasons, as we find out in this finale, means for her doing some wrongs in order to do some right. It's just this time it kind of backfired. I do feel that Dolores was really sorry for what happened to Hale and her family. As we all know, Dolores is really empathetic deep down, especially for a host who just had a sentiment of family ripped away from her. However, this is where it's revealed that Charlotte, or Haloris, or whatever you want to call her, isn't sorry, and that with the loss, she came out of it much much colder, saying that they were a weakness, something she needed to shed, and boasts that she still feels Dolores inside her, despite being a deviation of Dolores that has come more or less into her own persona. She knows all of the things that Dolores does and all of her plans, and has plans of her own. So honestly, things are going to get very interesting next season with this Echo of Dolores still around, and Echo honestly being the key word. But more on that with that post-credit scene later. But ladies and gentlemen, this is where we had Dolores versus Maeve, and I like their little talk before they started fighting, and where Dolores says, "I need you to trust me," and we all know why now, especially as we've seen the whole episode with her true intentions to save the world. And Maeve clapped back with the whole, like, that poor lost man, are you going to make him into another William? But at this point in the episode, without the true reveal of Dolores' plan, I was very apprehensive about Maeve. I mean, especially in this moment and the prior moments of her scenes with Serac, it just seemed that her character was being reduced as a tool. But obviously things changed down the line, especially by the end. Even though I still think Maeve's character was toned down a bit this season and made a bit simpler this season with her motivations for the sake of pinning her maybe just, you know, up against Dolores for all of it to just change towards the end. Of course, I am acknowledging that she does simply quite only care about her daughter, but I don't know, it's just not very sophisticated for a character such as Maeve. For example, I just feel even the lines in their fight scenes were just like, really? I don't think Maeve really would think that Dolores is just being evil for evil's sake, wanting to take down the world and replace it, in her own words, with copies of herself. And even the lines from Dolores in the fight saying that what becomes of the world will be up to them, you know, the humans, after taking down the system. And to be honest, Dolores is right. She wants to give humans a choice, and she just more or less said that to Maeve, but it's kind of ignored. But I just guess they really wanted to sell you with some doubt for Dolores' bigger picture being the end of everything and extinction for humans. But the fighting and the choreography in these scenes were just fantastic. I mean, they really were. Last episode it was great, but this was just the best and the blast. Quite a lot of fast-paced camera cuts in the fighting, but it was just done in a way that was pulled off very well. And after talking about Charlotte Hale just a second ago, this is where she popped up again and allowed Dolores to get captured, and saying that Dolores took measures to control her, so why would she do any different? And Dolores was shut down to be captured. Now, all while this was happening, Caleb was trying to get to Insight as the riots were going down, and we get to see that riot control bots were back in action once more. And he was even joined by Ash and Giggles again, but unfortunately Giggles got hit as Caleb gets away in the police craft. Hopefully we see him again, but you never know. I'm sure he's fine. But guys, on the other side of things that we haven't really spoken about yet, we had that moment from the end of last episode with William, Stubbs, and Bernard. And for William, it's time to atone for all of his sins as he open fires on them. Now Stubbs gets hit, and William escapes when the SFPD arrive, but really it's yet another copy of Dolores, and I'm sure you will remember Lawrence from the prior seasons of Westworld. And this is where he gives Bernard that package that Sato or Musashi sent off from the last episode. And it was also in this moment where Bernard says that Dolores hid something inside his mind and that he can feel it. So for all of us who were thinking that the key was in Bernard's mind, pat yourselves on the back, but I do feel like this was the one predictable thing out of this season that a lot of us knew. But does anyone else wonder who the other SFPD officer is? I mean, he addressed Bernard, so maybe it's another host? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if anyone else is speaking about that, but there is more to this, and maybe we'll see both of them next season. And this is where we got that very touching scene with Bernard and Arnold's wife after Lawrence gave him the location of where she is living. Now this provided for a very emotional scene for Bernard, as obviously we all know that he is based off of Arnold, and he still feels the pain from Arnold's son's death, Charlie, and how he thinks about him every day. And it seems that Arnold's wife could be suffering with something like dementia and has trouble remembering things, but recognized eventually that Bernard was Arnold. Overall, it was just a very special scene, and it shows the humanity that hosts can indeed feel, and Jeffrey Wright absolutely killed it with his acting here. Now at this point, Dolores was plugged into Rehoboam, and it was accessing her cognitive files to try and retrieve the data from the Delos Immortality Project. Serac also began deleting Dolores' memories one by one, and at this point I was like, really? Like, wait, are they going where I think they're going? And all at the same time as well, Caleb was captured infiltrating Insight and is brought before Serac, and we finally reached the climax of the episode in this one room with all the big players at the table. Now once again, to solidify this villainous role from Dolores even more, Serac tells Caleb to ask Rehoboam what would happen if he uploads Solomon's new strategy into its system, and Rehoboam predicts that there will be mass casualty events in the next 3 years, another one in 6 to 10 years, and then another in 12 to 16 years, and eventually population collapse within 23 years, which will ensure the end of human civilization. Now with this projection from Rehoboam, it really does make Caleb feel that this is what would happen had he successfully uploaded that drive from Solomon, and that surely this does mean that Dolores has been using him all along, since it seems that human extinction is pretty much assured by Rehoboam if this does go forward. And as we all know, Rehoboam and its predictions are pretty accurate, and is pretty much trying to get us all to think with that information as well. If humans were going to go extinct with this, does that really make Dolores the ultimate villain here all along? I mean, surely that does mean she was right, but the key thing here is that there's always a chance that this won't happen, and that's what Dolores is ultimately hoping for, not some cliche end of humanity villainous approach, but this freedom, liberation, and free will for humanity moving forward. And as she said last episode to Caleb, a new story for the human race with this new strategy from Solomon, not some semblance at a normal life as Serac put it, with this system governing everyone's lives, and essentially this disguised loop and narrative for the human race, in where they have absolutely no choice in what they do. And this even goes back to that line from Caleb, if you will remember, where he said to Liam Dempsey in the subway, where he'd rather live in chaos than live in a world controlled by you. And most certainly, it looks like things are going to be chaotic next season. And going back to that line from Dolores earlier, despite there being this anarchy right now, change is messy and difficult, and mirroring the beginning scene lines of how there is ugliness in this world, disarray, Dolores chooses to see the beauty, as humans created hosts, and they knew enough about beauty to teach it to them, so maybe they can indeed find it themselves, despite this new strategy being implemented with all of these projections of extinction. Dolores obviously has the optimism that mankind is capable of change that will prevent this extinction, but the thing is, Caleb, and as we'll likely see in the seasons moving forward throughout this messy change, that is likely a transition that will ensue for quite some time, the world will need a leader, a human one moving forward into this whole new world, and Caleb is the man for that, and Dolores knew it. And I just love how all of this was explained in that mindscape that Maeve and Dolores were in. This also tried to further give justification for Maeve's plot this season, which I think was decent, I guess. I mean, in how she understood Dolores' anger with them, and maybe she's even right, maybe they shouldn't exist, but is that really the right decision for Dolores to make? But I still feel like Maeve was just a bit basic this season. Sorry if I'm triggering any Maeve fans. I love Maeve, trust me, I really do. But that's when all of this explanation happens with Dolores, as we more or less just went over, with it concluding with her saying that they could annihilate them or tear down their world in the hopes that they can build a new one that's truly free, and then bring back the others from the Valley Beyond, or the Sublime if you want to call it. And I also really liked how the memories Dolores decided to hold on to weren't the ugly ones, but the moments from when she decided to remember of what humans were really capable of. And we got those almost nostalgic like flashbacks from prior seasons of like when a young William decided to help out Dolores and pick up that can, just kind of showcasing how, you know, there was obviously once good in William and decency, and that, you know, there is beauty in humans and mankind. And we saw Teddy. It was just so, I don't know, just hit me in the feels from those early seasons. Ultimately here though, Dolores is essentially the hero, albeit not necessarily a perfect one, despite it also being a bit of a messy path in getting there. But unfortunately, there is nothing left of her. She was wiped clean of her memories. I'm also a bit surprised that Maeve and Caleb didn't want to take a host control unit from her, just in case. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess there is nothing left, but still, I guess I'm just in denial. I don't want Dolores to really be gone. I would have picked it up to salvage it just in case. I mean, does this really mean she's gone? Like, gone? I know we still somewhat have her in the Charlotte Hale copy, or even the Lawrence copy, or even the Musashi copy, that because that host control unit was recovered. But Dolores Prime, is gone for at least now. And is this really Evan Rachel Wood's last appearance? I mean, obviously, even if it was, we'd still see her in some kind of flashback in a future season with her guest appearing, but is this her as a series regular over? Like, is that it? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But we still have things to discuss, guys, and that brings me to the other things of what were going on in this scene, and that is Rehoboam and Serac himself. And it turns out that Serac was his actual puppet, this performer who had this device attached to his ear, which was more or less this speaker from Rehoboam telling him exactly what to say. So all of this time, Serac has just been reciting lines from Rehoboam itself, and our theories in the fandom of this kind of being about hosts versus Rehoboam, AI versus AI, was actually the case, not Serac being this actual iteration of Rehoboam, but it was still kind of that in a way, because he was saying everything Rehoboam had to say. So yes and no with that last theory. But sure, Serac is a smart guy, but after this moment I just saw nothing from him but an actor, a performer, because the real voice behind him was the machine and the system. But I loved that turn from Maeve after this conversation with Dolores. It was just badass. She somehow hacked the device that controls her and destroyed it. I mean, I guess if you want to get nitpicky, she could have done that earlier in the season, and there was no one left but a wounded Serac, Caleb, and her. Now, it's also revealed in this moment that Dolores' last memory was Solomon's access, in which made Rehoboam give access to Caleb to lock out Serac, and Caleb's command to Rehoboam was to erase itself, thus ensuring the projection of human extinction coming into play. But then again, it might not. As Caleb said, she gave me a choice. I believe the rest of the world deserves one too. And that goes back to Dolores' optimism that things don't have to end that way for mankind, and hopefully Caleb will lead them into a safer future despite how accurate Rehoboam's projections usually are. Now, this is when it goes to Bernard, who senses that Dolores is indeed gone now, potentially solidifying her actual death, just in case, you know, we're thinking that she might pop up again in the future. He's come to realize that she wasn't the enemy, and that she wasn't trying to exterminate the human race, basically spelling it out to the audience members who may have been confused at this point. She was trying to save it because of what's about to happen with all of this anarchy, and how it was always going to happen, and even explained how Serac and his brother were just basically trying to hold it off, but there's still a chance. So perhaps next season we could see Bernard helping Maeve and Caleb moving forward. But this is when Bernard puts on the headset that he was given and uploads himself to the Valley Beyond, or the Sublime, in an effort to find an answer to what comes after the end of the world. And the season ends off with the scene of Maeve and Caleb in a world where you can do whatever the F you want, as the camera pans out on more or less the apocalypse. But as Bernard said, our world had to burn down before we could be free, and the same thing is happening in real life. But of course, guys, we have those post-credit scenes, and this video is getting on quite a bit now, and I will probably be doing separate videos to this, but of course I do want to cover them in the actual episode review and breakdown. So the first being William. Earlier in the episode, he got the locations of Delo assets worldwide because in his mind he wants to save the world, and here in the post-credit scene we see him go to the Delos International building in Dubai, in where he demands to see where the hosts are, because he just knows this is where they've set themselves up to breed, and he wasn't wrong after all, because he goes to the lower levels of the research lab, and lo and behold, there is Charlotte Hale Dolores, of whom really isn't all that much Dolores anymore, as we've discussed, but someone new. And she reveals to William that he's right, he is going to save the world for them. And then the man in black walks out of nowhere, and they get into a fight, and William's throat gets cut, which you can pretty much assume would leave him dead, even though we don't see him actually die. Now, I'm guessing that Charlotte Hale has created this man in black, or maybe more of them, or I'm guessing maybe just one for now, as her soldier or soldiers moving forward, perhaps to ensure the successful delivery of her plans moving forward, as it's revealed that she's got many hosts being developed in that other room, potentially creating an army. I'm also thinking that bottom line, Charlotte Hale's plan is actually what the show wanted you to believe about Dolores, or what Bernard believed about Dolores, in how they wanted us to believe that she was going to exterminate humanity, where in fact, after what Charlotte Hale has been through here, or Shaloris, or Heloris, or whatever you want to call her, that is now her desire, and these Man in Black copies or copy can help her go about that plan. But I don't know about anyone else. Is anyone wondering about the season 2 ending with William at the Forge in what seemed to be the far future, and where his daughter was talking to him about fidelity? I mean, whatever happened to that? I mean, I'm wondering, is this that host version of what we saw at the end of season 2 with that cliffhanger, more or less getting inducted into the world before seeing him kill the real William here? And now that William is dead, or at least we can assume to be dead, I mean, however, as I said earlier, we didn't actually see him die, so I'd love to just hear your thoughts on all of that as well. And lastly, guys, we have Bernard, who wakes up and doesn't exactly seem happy, which indicates he's either come back with a plan and he's just like, right, I'm going to do this, or things in the Valley Beyond may not be so heavenly as we've been thinking. Either way, a lot of time has passed, and when I say a lot, I mean ages. For him to gather that amount of dust is just insane. I'm guessing that this hotel room has absolutely no service, and he's just been sat there this entire time, and I'm guessing that by this point, Stubbs has just turned into a skeleton, but I suppose with the anarchy outside, maybe this hotel has just been abandoned since. But that is my breakdown, guys. I'm sorry it was so long. I know it was a bit longer than usual, but, you know, as for this season, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it definitely was better than season 2. Season 1 will always be the OG season, but as for many shows, I get some criticism for the show, but overall, I think it's a severely underrated show. This show, for setting itself in a completely new environment, has adapted in such a good way and still kept all of the things that make Westworld Westworld, and I honestly just applaud them for being able to do that, and I just really hope this isn't it for Dolores. But yeah, what an episode, what a season. What do you guys think? What do you think of my thoughts? What are your theories about absolutely everything? I'm dying to hear all of it in the comments down below. Thank you for all of your continued support on the channel. It really does mean a lot, getting a bit more of a Westworld audience this season, and trust me, stay subscribed because I will be coming out with future videos and of course coverage on whenever that season 4 does come. You can be sure to know that I will be covering it on this channel. But thank you so much for watching, guys. Leave a like if you did enjoy it, but I'll see you hosts in the next video. Goodbye.